There is a kind of suffering that doesn't make sense. Not the kind you can trace back to a decision you made, a relationship you broke, a warning you ignored. Not the suffering that comes with a clear cause and a lesson attached. This is the other kind. The kind that arrives without explanation. The kind that hits people who, by every measure, did nothing to deserve it. And if you've ever sat in that place, or watched someone you love sit there, you already know the question that follows it like a shadow. Why did God let this happen? That question is not new. It is not a product of modern skepticism or internet atheism or a culture that has lost its faith. It is one of the oldest questions in human history. And the Bible doesn't avoid it. It dedicates an entire book to it. A book that is older than most of the Old Testament. A book that begins not with creation or covenant or law, but with a man sitting in silence, and a conversation happening in heaven that he knows nothing about. His name is Job. And the book that carries his name is not what most people think it is. Most people treat Job as a story about patience. You've probably heard it summarized that way. Job suffered, Job waited, Job was eventually restored, the end. A morality tale about enduring hard times with your faith intact. But that reading misses almost everything. The book of Job is not primarily about patience. It is about the limits of human understanding when it comes face to face with divine purpose. It is about what happens when the frameworks we use to explain suffering collapse completely. And it is about a God who is far less interested in giving us explanations than we want him to be, and far more present in the silence than we expect. To understand why God let it happen, you have to start with what happened. And the text is remarkably blunt about it. Job 1 verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. 4 descriptions. Blameless, upright, God-fearing, evil-avoiding. The Hebrew word for blameless is tam. It doesn't mean sinless. It means whole, complete, integrated, a man whose inner life and outer life matched. He wasn't performing righteousness. He was righteous. And God himself confirms it. Twice in the opening chapter, God points to Job and says, essentially, there is no one like him on earth. This detail is critical. Because the moment you establish that Job is genuinely righteous, the entire conventional framework for suffering breaks down. The conventional framework goes like this. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. If you are suffering, look inward. You have probably done something to deserve it. This framework is comfortable. It's tidy. It puts humans in control. It makes the universe feel fair and predictable and manageable. The book of Job demolishes it in the first 2 chapters. Because here is what follows the introduction of this blameless, upright, God-fearing man. Scene shift. Heaven. A gathering of divine beings presenting themselves before God. And among them, a figure identified in Hebrew as the Satan. Not yet a proper name, the definite article that tells you it's a title. The accuser. The adversary. A prosecutorial figure whose role, apparently, includes roaming the earth and filing reports. God initiates. Where have you come from? The accuser answers. From roaming the earth, going back and forth on it. And then God does something that has troubled readers for centuries. He brings up Job. Unprompted. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth. The accuser's response is cynical and precise. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will curse you to your face. The accusation beneath the accusation is this. Job's faith is transactional. He worships God because God pays him to. Remove the benefits, and you'll see what's really there. The righteousness is a performance propped up by prosperity. And God says, and this is the part that stops people cold, very well. Everything he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on the man himself. Why? Why would God agree to this? This is the question that pulls most people out of the story entirely. It feels like God is gambling with a human life. Like Job is a pawn in a cosmic wager. Like the creator of the universe looked down at one of his most faithful servants and said, "Let's see how far he bends before he breaks." But that reading misses the architecture of what's actually happening. The accuser's challenge is not just about Job. It's about the nature of worship itself. It's about whether genuine, unconditional love for God is even possible. If every human being who worships God does so only because of what they receive in return, then worship is not worship. It is commerce. It is a transaction dressed in religious language. And the accusation extends far beyond Job. It extends to everyone who has ever claimed to love God. God's permission is not cruelty. It is a refusal to let the accusation stand unanswered. The testing of Job is not designed to break him. It is designed to prove something true. Something that the accuser insists is impossible. That a human being can love God not for what God gives, but for who God is. And then the suffering begins. In rapid succession, Job loses everything. His oxen and donkeys, raided. His sheep, burned. His camels, taken. His servants, killed. And then the worst. A messenger arrives. A great wind struck the house where his children were feasting. The house collapsed. They are all dead. 10 children, gone. Job tears his robe. He shaves his head. He falls to the ground. And he says, and the text records this as the response of a man who has just lost everything, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job 1 verse 22. In all this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Round 1. The accuser's thesis fails. But the accuser returns. And this time, the challenge escalates. Touch his body. Touch his health. Then you'll see. God permits it. Job is struck with painful sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He sits in the ashes, scraping himself with a piece of broken pottery. His wife, watching him, says what many people in that situation would say. "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." And Job answers her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" Job 2 verse 10. In all this Job did not sin with his lips. Then his friends arrive. 3 of them. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. They come to comfort him. And when they see him, they can barely recognize him. They weep. They tear their robes. They sit with him on the ground in silence for 7 days. 7 days without a word. That silence is the most pastoral thing they do in the entire book. Everything that follows it makes things worse. Because when the friends finally speak, they bring the conventional framework with them. They are convinced, each in their own variation, that Job must have done something. Eliphaz says it diplomatically at first, then harshly. Bildad is blunter. Zophar is brutal. The logic is always the same. God is just. Suffering is punishment. Therefore Job has sinned. The solution is repentance. Job refuses. And this is where the book becomes something extraordinary. Because Job doesn't respond with patience. He doesn't respond with quiet acceptance. He argues. He pushes back. He accuses his friends of speaking falsely. He demands an audience with God. He says things that sound, on the surface, like borderline blasphemy. Job 13 verse 3. But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. Job 16 verse 17. Although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. Job 19 verse 25. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. Job is not passive. He is in agony and he is fighting, not fighting against God, but fighting toward God. He refuses his friend's diagnosis. He refuses to confess to sins he didn't commit. He refuses to let a tidy theological framework override his actual experience. And his actual experience is this: I did not deserve this. I do not understand it. And I need God Himself to explain it. And then a fourth voice enters. A young man named Elihu who has been listening this entire time. He is angry at Job for seeming to justify himself rather than God, and angry at the 3 friends for failing to answer Job. Elihu's speeches are long and often overlooked. but they serve a function. They push the conversation past the friend's retributive framework toward something larger. God is greater than any human accounting system. His ways are not legible to human logic. The suffering of the righteous is not always punishment. Sometimes it is instruction. Sometimes it is purification. Sometimes it is something else entirely that human categories cannot contain. And then God speaks. Job 38 verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. What follows is one of the most remarkable passages in all of Scripture. God asks Job a series of questions, not rhetorical insults, but genuine invitations to confront the scale of reality. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you entered the springs of the sea? Can you bind the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? Do you know the ordinances of heaven? Can you lift your voice to the clouds? Chapter after chapter, question after question. God does not explain the wager. God does not mention the heavenly council. God does not offer Job a theological framework for his suffering. He does not say, "Here is why it happened, and here is what I needed to prove, and here is how it all makes sense." He says something far more disorienting. He says, "Look at what you are standing in. Look at the scope of what has been made. Look at the depth and the breadth and the complexity and the wildness of a creation you can barely name, let alone comprehend. And then ask yourself, do you really think your suffering is outside the reach of the one who made all of this?" Job's response is not argument. It is silence. And then something else. Job 42 verse 5. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. This is the pivot. Not an explanation. Not a resolution of the theological problem. A vision. An encounter. A direct experience of God that changes something in Job that no answer ever could have. And then God turns to the three friends and says something that has stunned theologians for centuries. My anger burns against you, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Job, who argued and pushed and demanded and said things his friends called blasphemous, Job spoke rightly. The friends, who defended God's honor and maintained theological orthodoxy and insisted on the retributive framework, they did not. Why? Because the friends were protecting a system. Job was seeking a person. The friends needed God to be explainable, manageable, contained within their framework. Job needed God himself. Even if God didn't answer. Even if the silence stretched on. Even if the suffering made no sense. He wanted God, not a doctrine about God. And God honored that. This is the theological center of the book. And it is not comfortable. It does not give you a formula for why suffering happens. It does not tell you that your pain has a hidden purpose you'll understand later. It does not promise that if you hold on long enough, everything will be restored. What it does is something different. It tells you that the God who is present in your suffering is a God of unimaginable scope and depth and intelligence. A God who is not surprised by your pain. A God who is not absent from it. A God who, in the middle of the most inexplicable suffering, can be sought and found and encountered. Job is restored at the end of the book. New children. New wealth. Longer life. Many readers feel uncomfortable with this ending. It feels like the retributive framework sneaking back in through the rear door. Suffer enough, hold on long enough, get restored. But that is not the point of the restoration. The restoration is not a reward for good behavior during the test. It is a statement about the character of God. A God who allows suffering is not a God who delights in it. The same God who permitted the loss is the God who restores. Not because Job earned it, but because restoration is what this God does. The book of Job does not answer the question, why did God let this happen, in the way we want it answered. It does not give us a clean, systematic theology of suffering. What it gives us is something more honest and, in the end, more durable. It gives us a portrait of a God who is present in the storm, who is not threatened by our anger or our questions or our demands for an audience, who invites us to look at the scope of reality and trust that the one who holds all of it is holding us too, who calls our honest wrestling righteous and calls our tidy theological systems into question. And it gives us a man who lost everything, who argued with God, who refused easy answers, who sat in the ash heap and still said, I know that my Redeemer lives. That is not patience. That is something rarer and harder and more beautiful. That is faith that doesn't need an explanation to survive. If the book of Job is landing differently for you today than it ever has before, share this with someone who is sitting in a hard season right now. They may need this more than they can say. And subscribe, because this is the kind of conversation we are going to keep having. The suffering doesn't always make sense, but the God in the middle of it does. And that, it turns out, is enough.